50 years. That's how long Marine veteran John Miller wore the same faded cap, day and night, summer and winter. Neighbors thought it was just a habit. But under that cap hid something no one was prepared to see. And it all began in the steaming jungles of Vietnam. What secret could a man hide for half a lifetime? Stay with us, and make sure you follow this channel, because the truth will shock you. The rain came down in a steady, patient rhythm, tapping the tin awning like a drummer who knew only one song. John Miller sat at the small wooden table by the window, the same table he'd had since the year Nixon resigned, his hands cupped around a mug he'd reheated 3 times. The light was the color of watered milk, and it slid over the brim of his cap, catching on the frayed stitching where his thumb had worn a groove. He pressed the cap down without thinking, a reflex older than his grandkids. The house had settled into its usual creaks, the walls expanding and contracting like an old lung, and beyond the glass, the street lay slick and empty, a thin silver vein running past his porch. If you carry a secret long enough, it stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like your spine. That was what he told himself when the temptation rose, fingers lifting just a hair, the urge to peel the cap back and let air find what it hadn't touched in years. 50 years, he thought, and the number rolled heavy in his chest. 50 years of not letting barbers finish, of ducking cameras, of keeping to shade and corners and the edges of crowds. 50 years of pretending the hat was a habit, a quirk, an old Marine refusing to let go. He could almost hear Linda teasing him from the kitchen. "You gonna sleep in that thing, John?" And he could almost hear his own reply, warm and automatic, the small joke that sent them both into the sweet, quiet lane that had been their marriage. He rubbed the brim now and felt the soft give of the fabric, the place his worry had polished smooth. Across the street, Mrs. Parker's wind chimes ticked faintly. She'd told him once that the sound was better than company, less maintenance, fewer opinions. He'd nodded because that's what he did, nodding his way through the politeness of a small town. They knew him as the quiet Marine who lived alone and tipped in exact change. They waved when he waved, they minded their fences, and when they wondered about the cap, they wondered privately. The children didn't. Children are born investigators. They whispered and pointed and sometimes dared each other to run and snatch. Nobody ever made it to the brim. John had a way of turning at the right moment, or stepping just out of reach, or letting a stare do the kind of work only age can do. He took a careful sip of coffee. It had the aftertaste of scorched glass and he didn't mind. The rain swelled on the awning and softened again. A drum, then a brush. And in that nothing rhythm he felt the old memory press a damp hand to the back of his neck. The jungle rain had been heavier, hotter, the kind of rain that shows you like a sentence. This Pittsburgh rain was a gentle imitation, a high school play of the real thing. But it was enough to lay a thin green film over the morning. His scalp itched, not with pain but with memory, a phantom hum beneath his hat, and without taking the cap off he ran his palm over the crown, feeling the familiar uneven landscape, the contours he could trace blind. He let the hand fall, set the mug down, and told himself out loud that it was time to pick up bread and the card for Emily's boy. 6 already, and still young enough to call him Grandpa, like the word had marbles in it. Main Street looked rinsed and new, colors deepened by water. The grocery's bell chimed as he pushed through, and the store smelled like coffee and floor cleaner, and the kind of fruit that's never been near dirt. He nodded to the clerk and stepped into the narrow aisle, eyes down, a list of 3 things beating time in his head. Bread, milk, card with balloons. He had the bread in his hand, honey wheat, the one Emily said the kids would actually eat, when the giggle rose behind him, bright and small and reckless. He turned and saw 2 boys in rain-dark hoodies, faces pink with the thrill of a dare. They were at the age where all their edges were still round. "Go on," one whispered to the other, not as quiet as he thought he was. "Don't," John said. But his voice was soft, and the word came too late for boys whose muscles had already said yes. The smaller one darted forward with that fearless speed that belongs to children and thieves and grabbed the brim of John's cap. It wasn't a full snatch, just enough of a tug to peel the front edge up, just enough of a lift to let light pour under, where light didn't belong. The fluorescent glare fell hard and cold on the skin beneath, and the boy's mouth opened. His eyes did the thing eyes do, when the world suddenly isn't what it was a second ago. They widened without a sound. John had the hat back down before breath could decide whether to leave him. The bread fell, and he left it on the floor. The clerk looked up, started forward, thought better, and looked down again. John didn't run. You can't run with 72-year-old knees and a lifetime of pride. He carried himself out the door like a man leaving church too early, and found the old rhythm of his feet on wet sidewalk. On the way home, the rain burned him with its kindness. The boys' faces followed him in the glass of windows and the metal of cars. Their shock wasn't cruel, it was clean, and somehow that hurt worse. In his kitchen, he put the bread on the counter and only then noticed he hadn't bought it. His hands shook a little. He pressed them flat to the wood and told himself that despite everything he'd learned, a man could still be surprised by his own endurance. He set the hat with unusual care on the table and stared at it like it might blink. The fabric had gone the color of old money, green that couldn't remember how to be green. The sweatband was a history of summers. Near the back, there was a darker patch where sap had once stained the cloth, and he touched it the way people touch the photograph of someone they loved and lost. He'd scrubbed that spot until his fingers had gone numb, and still the stain had stayed, stubborn as a nail you can't pull because the wood around it is softer than you want to admit. He lifted the hat, turned it, traced the seam again, and in the dead air of the kitchen, his father's radio rose from a time that no longer existed. A baseball game with the crowd like bees and the announcer flat and warm. The sound slid away, replaced by a memory louder than radios, the rotor slap of a helicopter beating the sky thin. He carried the hat into the hall and stood in front of the mirror. A man's house is full of thresholds, doorways, stairs, the line where carpet becomes tile. Mirrors are thresholds too, and he had learned how to cross this one without looking. Today the pull was stronger than the dread. He tilted the cap, lifted it an inch, two, and felt the cool breath of the hallway touch what it hadn't touched in so long. A tremor ran along the ridge of skin, the way old scars sometimes ripple when weather shifts. He froze. The man in the mirror froze with him. He saw the set of his jaw, marine stubborn, that old limestone, saw the bracket lines at the corners of his mouth and the eyes that had learned how to be still. Behind those eyes, another pair flickered into place, a younger man's eyes, alert as wire, the jungle reflected in them like a polished barrel. He lowered the cap. The mirror took him back without complaint. It wasn't fear of pain. Pain had been a loud lesson in his youth, a crude teacher who, for all its lack of nuance, had never lied to him. This was different. This was the fear of being seen, the fear of becoming a story in someone else's mouth. He pressed the hat down again and stood in the empty hall, the house around him the way a shell surrounds the thing that made it. He could feel the boy's small hand at the brim still, a ghost pressure, and he let the memory fade grain by grain until the kitchen's clock took over, ticking him back into the day. He tried the television, left the sound down as he always did. The faces moved without noise, and he imagined the anchors talking about weather somewhere else, or a factory closing, or a man in a photogenic suit who had opinions about policy. He didn't need their voices to fill the room. The rain did that, and the house's old timbers did, and so did the thing under his hat, which had a presence like the hum of a refrigerator you don't hear until it stops. He watched the crawl at the bottom of the screen roll by with names of cities he'd never see again, and wondered how many men sat in those places at tables just like his, holding the brim the way he did, pretending the hand was idle. Lunch came and went without passion. He ate a ham sandwich and thought about bread he hadn't bought and cards he hadn't chosen. He thought about Emily, and when he did, his breath found a snag. Emily had her mother's mouth and her own stubbornness, which meant she could let a silence bloom without watering it with cheap words. He respected that, even when it made the room feel smaller. Twice he had reached to tell her the truth, and twice he had put his hand down on an old Thursday, on an average Tuesday, because there is no good day to make your daughter carry the thing you haven't put down. He took the trash out because you can always rely on chores to trick your brain into believing you're a man with a plan. On the porch, the rain had softened to a mist that turned the neighborhood to watercolor. Mrs. Parker came by with her little dog wearing a ridiculous yellow coat. She waved and he waved back. Her eyes flicked up to the brim, habit, curiosity, kindness wrapped around nosiness. "Staying dry there, Mr. Miller?" she called, and he thought for a second she meant more than he could answer. "Best I can," he said, and the dog sneezed, and the moment folded politely in the middle. Afternoon was a quiet animal. He coaxed it to evening with small motions, washing a plate that didn't need it, tightening a screw that wasn't loose, oiling a hinge that would never stop complaining. The house smelled faintly of lemon, the brand of furniture polish he'd bought the year Linda died and never changed. Grief had a taste. Lemon was part of his. A little before dusk, when the sky had the bruised color it wore just before giving in tonight, he walked to the porch with his second favorite chair. The first favorite had been his and Linda's together, the one with the cup ring on the arm and the cushion that never forgave you for standing up. It had gone out in bulk trash the spring after the funeral, and he had walked the chair to the curb with his cap pulled low, feeling eyes on him that may well have been only his own. The second favorite chair was good enough. He sat and let cicadas build their summer engine, the sound a long dry rope thrown across the day. His palms rested on his thighs, a soldier's instinct that had never left, and after a while the small muscles in his shoulders unwound like knots someone had been patient with. He thought of Vietnam not as a story, but as a temperature. When he remembered it, his skin got wet and his breath thickened, and even in Pennsylvania the air grew a kind of weight. The memory used to come like an ambush. Now it came like weather, forecastable, survivable, but never entirely your idea. He could call up details the way you call up a menu. The smell of rot worked into your socks, the metallic sweetness of blood and rainwater, the way the jungle held its breath right before it didn't. He thought of the first itch under the helmet, and how he'd shrugged it off, because shrugging things off was the only way you got through. He thought of sap hitting steel with a sound like a tongue clicking its disapproval. He thought of Patterson's hands, competent and tired, and of Ray's laugh, which had a hitch in it like a record with a thin scratch across the chorus. He went to bed early, because that's what old men do when night is more generous than morning. Lying flat made the cap's contour shift against his pillow. He tilted his head and found the spot that didn't complain and closed his eyes. Sleep came cautiously, like a dog who has to be convinced. He drifted and woke and drifted again, and somewhere in that soft gray space, the rain of another place began. The monsoon was a second heartbeat, a drum behind his own, and in the dream his boots sank to the ankle, and then to the shin, and then all the way to the knee. The helmet slipped forward. He pushed it back. His fingers found his scalp, and heat jumped under his nails. He woke with a small, undignified noise, breath-catching, eyes seeing only his ceiling fan turning the room into slices. He sat up and it was still night, but it was also early morning, one of those muddy hours that doesn't belong to either, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed and let his feet find the floor he had memorized. In the bathroom, the mirror was less forgiving, the light on a dimmer he never brightened all the way. He stood, and the man stood with him. He took hold of the brim with both hands. He lifted. The air moved over skin that felt both his and not his. He didn't look away this time. He looked, and what he saw was what he knew, and what he knew was the thing that had shaped his days, the clustered. Shapes like grapes, the pale and the darker, the smooth and the wrinkled, the way some of them moved almost imperceptibly when he swallowed. He held himself steady, and then, as if he'd been caught in an impolite stare, he put the hat back on, not in panic but in a practiced, careful motion, the way you might close a door to keep heat in. When morning finally arrived with its weak coffee light, he was already at the table, already making lists in his head he didn't write down. The store, again, later, for bread he pretended to need. The card with balloons, maybe a call to Emily if his voice felt up to it. He traced the seam of the cap and let the rain carry him just to the edge of the jungle and no farther. Outside, a delivery truck sighed to a stop. A man jumped down, a door thumped, and the world continued doing its very best to be ordinary. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the one from before the hat had become law. The young man in it kept his mouth in a straight line, and his eyes on the middle distance where officers lived, and he wore his helmet like he believed it would make him immortal. John stood and stepped closer until his breath fogged the glass and he wiped it with the side of his hand, a motion that felt too much like tenderness. He thought he'd talk to Linda then, the way he did sometimes when the house got small, but he didn't, because ghosts are loud enough when you let them be. He set his palm on the frame once, and then he went back to his chair, and the sound of rain, and the work of holding himself together for one more day. And then, because the universe has a sense of timing, and it isn't always cruel, the phone rang. The first thing that hit him was the heat, a wet slap that crawled over every inch of exposed skin and slid under the parts covered in cloth. Even before the helicopter's skids kissed the muddy clearing, the air surged in, thick with the green smell of crushed vegetation and the acrid bite of engine fuel. The rotors churned up a storm of grit and rain, each drop driven sideways hard enough to sting, and the noise was so big it swallowed his thoughts. John Miller, 22 and wiry from months of training, kept his head low, one hand on the M16 across his chest, the other gripping the web strap of his pack. The bird rocked as it settled. Then the crew chief gave the signal. John jumped into ankle-deep muck that sucked at his boots like it wanted to keep them. Behind him, more Marines spilled out, each man instantly drenched in the kind of rain that made a mockery of ponchos. The sky above Quang Tri province was a ceiling of bruised cloud, the downpour as steady as a clock. It didn't matter if you were in it for a minute or a month, you were soaked and you stayed soaked. He pushed forward through the rotor wash toward the tree line, where the world shifted to a darker green and the sound of the helicopter was already muffled. Ray was just ahead, turning his head enough to shout something John couldn't hear. Ray's grin was white against the mud streaking his face, the kind of grin you put on to tell the other guy you're not scared even if you both are. Behind them, Patterson, the corpsman, lugged his kit like it weighed nothing. He was older than most of them, 27 maybe, and carried himself with the weary calm of a man who'd seen enough trouble to know there's no profit in rushing toward it. They moved in a staggered column toward a patch of ground that had been claimed as a forward position, a few chest-high walls of sandbags, a crude tent half swallowed by jungle, the smell of wet canvas and something metallic underneath. The rain drummed on their helmets and splashed off the sandbags, ran in silver threads down their necks. Somewhere far away, so far it might have been in another country, artillery thumped, low enough that you felt it more than heard it. By the time they dumped their gear under the tent, John's utilities clung to him like another layer of skin. He set his rifle down carefully, checked the chamber out of habit, then peeled off his helmet. Steam rose faintly from the liner. The relief lasted all of 2 minutes before the heat and humidity closed in again, and he jammed the helmet back on, feeling the sweat trickle from hairline to jaw. The jungle had its own rules about sound. The helicopter's thunder gave way to 1,000 smaller noises. The drip of water from leaf to leaf, the saw whine of unseen insects, the occasional heavy rustle that meant something larger was on the move. You learned not to think too hard about what was making which sound. Thinking too much out here was like stopping in the middle of a river. You'd just get swept under. 3 days later, they were moving again, deep into a stretch of elephant grass that sliced at their forearms and hid the ground from view. The rain was a mist now, clinging to lashes and lips. John pushed a stalk aside and felt it whip back against his cheek. The ground was soft and treacherous, every other step sinking into mud that smelled of rot. He kept his eyes moving, scanning for tripwires, the kind of wire that could turn the next step into your last. Ray was behind him now, muttering a song under his breath, something old and country. Patterson trudged silently, eyes fixed ahead. It was in that mess of grass and water that it happened. A branch overhead, heavy with rain and something else, shook loose as he passed. A glob of thick, amber sap dropped square onto the crown of his helmet, rolled, and found the bare skin just at his hairline. The sting was instant, like fire wrapped in glue. He winced, swore softly, and reached up to wipe it away. The sap clung stubbornly, warm against his scalp even in the rain. He rubbed harder, feeling grit and bark under his nails, and finally let it be. There were bigger things to worry about, like the sudden rustle off to the right that made every man freeze and bring his weapon up. The noise faded. A bird, maybe. Maybe not. They moved on. That night, under the droop of a poncho strung between 2 poles, he sat cleaning his rifle. The sap was still there, a faint tackiness he could feel when he shifted the helmet. His scalp itched in a way that was different from the usual sweat and grime, a slow burn that made him want to scratch until skin came away. He reached up, ran his fingers over the spot, and found a tiny bump, smooth, hard, the size of a pea. He frowned, pressed it once, and then let his hand fall. You didn't go to the corpsman over a bump, not when men were coming back with holes in them. Patterson, crouched nearby, was rewrapping a bandage on Ray's arm, a graze from a stray branch that had drawn more blood than it should have. You keep rubbing your head like that, Patterson said without looking up. You're gonna wear a hole in it. Just an itch, John replied. Everything itches out here, Patterson said. Keep it clean. John nodded, though clean was a word that didn't mean much in this place. 2 weeks later, they were sent on a night patrol that turned into a running firefight. The rain came down in sheets so thick the muzzle flashes looked smeared. They dropped into the mud behind a fallen log, returned fire until their fingers cramped. At some point, a round cracked into the tree above John's head, showering him with splinters and more sap, this time mixed with the sour smell of burning wood. By the time they fought their way back to the sandbags, he was too tired to think about anything but the next breath. The itch, the bump, they were still there, waiting. Days bled into weeks. The bump was joined by another, just behind his right ear. Sometimes they ached in the heat, a dull pulse that matched the rain's rhythm. He thought about mentioning it to Patterson, but there was always something else, an infected cut on someone's leg, a fever that had to be sweated out, A kid too scared to sleep, who needed someone to sit with him until dawn one afternoon. Ray sat beside him cleaning his own rifle. "You're always adjusting that helmet," Ray said. "Trying to start a new style?" "Maybe," John said. He kept his tone light. Ray smirked. "Well, whatever keeps you pretty." The sky opened again, rain slanting through the tent flap, and the conversation drowned under the steady hiss. John leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sound wash over him, not knowing that what had started with a drop of sap would follow him out of this jungle and into every day that came after. They were moving along a narrow trail cut into the jungle by months of boots, a line of dark mud bordered by walls of foliage so thick it looked solid. The rain had paused for the first time in days, leaving the air heavy and wet as a sponge. Every breath tasted green, ferns, moss, and the slow rot of leaves that had never seen the sun. John walked third in the line, Ray ahead of him, Patterson a few steps behind. The rest of the squad stretched out like beads on a string that could snap any second. They'd been out for 6 hours, sweeping a low ridge for signs of enemy movement. It was the kind of work that felt more like waiting than walking. Every few yards, someone would stop, crouch, scan the trees, listen for the sound that didn't belong. You learned to pick out the difference between a bird's wings and a man shifting his weight. You learned that the jungle could lie. When it happened, it was almost polite at first, a single crack in the air, sharp but distant. Then the second shot came closer, and the ridge exploded into noise. Men dropped to their knees, rifles up, scanning for muzzle flashes. The fire came from somewhere ahead and slightly above, bullets stitching the ground and splintering branches overhead. John pressed himself into the mud, sighted toward a flicker of movement in the tree line, and returned fire. The sound was deafening in the confined space, every shot a hammer strike in his skull. "Left flank!" Ray's voice cut through the noise. John saw him pivot, firing toward a second burst of gunfire. Patterson had already moved to cover a man who'd gone down hard, blood spreading fast under his arm. The corpsman worked with the precision of someone who had done this too many times. Gauze, pressure, a muttered reassurance that was more for the others than for the wounded man. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but time in those moments doesn't move like time anywhere else. When the shooting stopped, the jungle closed in again, the sounds of birds and insects returning hesitantly, as if testing the air. 2 men were dead. One was Ray's closest friend in the squad, a kid named MC Kinley who'd arrived barely 3 weeks earlier. He'd been shot through the neck, quick and quiet. They carried the bodies back to the sandbags wrapped in ponchos, the rain starting again in thin, cold lines. No one talked much. Ray walked with his jaw set, his eyes locked on the ground in front of him. That night he sat beside John under the drooping edge of the tent, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "You ever think about what it's going to be like after?" Ray asked, not looking at him. "After what?" "After this. If we make it back, you think we just pick up where we left off?" John didn't answer right away. The question felt too big for the space they were in. Finally he said, "I don't know, maybe we don't get to pick." Ray nodded slowly, smoke curling out into the damp air. MC Kinley was talking about buying a car when he got home, a red one. Said he'd drive it until the wheels fell off. Guess that's one way to do it. Patterson walked past then, his kit slung over one shoulder, his eyes shadowed. He paused just long enough to look at John. "If that thing on your head's still bothering you, come see me in the morning," he said quietly. John touched the spot under his helmet. The bump was still there, hard and foreign. "It's fine," he said. Patterson didn't argue. He just kept walking, his boots sucking at the mud. The rain thickened through the night, drumming against the canvas above them, finding every seam. John lay awake, listening to it, thinking about MC Kinley's red car, about Ray's question, about the small, stubborn thing under his skin that refused to be ignored. Somewhere deep in the dark, a flare went up over the tree line, bleaching the jungle in ghost light for 3 long seconds before dropping away. In that flash, John thought he saw the ridge again, saw the muzzle flare, saw the way the world could change between heartbeats, and how some things, once they began, never really stopped. The air on the tarmac in California felt wrong in his lungs. Light, dry, stripped of the wet weight he'd been carrying for over a year. For a few seconds after stepping off the transport plane, John Miller just stood there, duffel slung over one shoulder, feeling like someone had taken the jungle out of the air but left it in his skin. The sky was a sharp, open blue that made his eyes water. Around him, families were breaking into sprints toward their sons, brothers, husbands. The air was full of shouts and laughter, and the kind of crying that comes from relief. No one came for him. His parents had been gone before he even shipped out. The girl who used to write him letters, she'd stopped months into his deployment, her last note a polite, final kind of thing. He'd read it once and shoved it deep into the bottom of his pack, under socks that smelled like mildew. He didn't mind the quiet, not in the way some men would. He kept his head down, found the bus they'd told him to find, and slid into a seat near the back. The Marines riding with him were all carrying different versions of the same stare, some looking out the window like the landscape was a language they'd forgotten, some with eyes closed, mouths set in a line that didn't invite talk. John watched the country go by, dry hills giving way to flat farmland, the occasional small town where someone had hung a flag from a porch and waved at the bus as it rumbled past. He wondered if they waved for him too, or just for the uniform in general. By the time he stepped off the final bus in his hometown in Pennsylvania, the sun was low, and the streets felt smaller than he remembered. The brick buildings looked older, the paint on the diner sign more faded. It wasn't just that the town had changed, it was him. He'd been stretched in a way that didn't let you shrink back. He found a room above a hardware store, the kind of place where you paid cash once a month to a landlord you rarely saw. The bed sagged in the middle, and the walls smelled faintly of the varnish they sold downstairs. He didn't bother unpacking much, just the essentials and the few photographs he'd managed to keep dry. Work came easy enough. An old friend of his father's owned a garage on the edge of town and offered him a job. John took it without asking about pay. He liked the rhythm of it, the clink of tools in the morning, the hiss of an air compressor, the smell of oil and grease. Engines made sense to him. They were problems you could take apart, clean and put back together. No mud, no rain, no enemies hiding in the tree line. For a while he thought maybe that was it, just work, food, and sleep. The bump on his scalp was still there, but it wasn't doing much. It was easy to ignore when you kept your helmet on in the jungle. It was just as easy when you kept your cap on in town. He'd bought a plain olive drab one at the surplus store, not because he missed the core, but because it felt familiar, and it kept his head warm in the winter. He wore it at the garage too, and no one asked about it. Some of the older guys wore caps to keep the sweat out of their eyes. It was just another piece of the uniform. Then, one morning about a year after coming home, he caught sight of something in the bathroom mirror. While shaving, the bump looked a little bigger, or maybe the hair around it was thinner, making it stand out more. He touched it, felt the same hard smoothness as before. It didn't hurt, but there was a strange comfort in pressing it and feeling it refuse to give. He rinsed the razor, wiped the steam off the glass, and told himself it was nothing. Just a thing you picked up somewhere, like a scar or a limp. He had no idea how many of those were still coming. He met Linda in the diner across from the garage on a Tuesday in late spring. He'd been going there for weeks, sitting at the same counter stool during his lunch break, eating the same meatloaf special, saying little to anyone. She was new, filling in for a waitress who'd just had a baby, and she noticed him because he never took off his cap, not even when he ate. "Coffee?" she asked, sliding the pot toward him. He nodded. "Black." "You a man of many words," she said, smiling without pushing. Something in her tone, light but with a hint of challenge, made him look up. She had dark hair pulled back in a loose knot and eyes that didn't flinch from meeting his. For a second, he felt the urge to say something more. Instead, he just said, "Thanks," when she filled his cup. They talked a little more each time he came in. She learned he worked at the garage, that he liked his coffee hot and his pie cold, that he didn't like to be fussed over. He learned she had grown up one town over, that her father had been a steel worker until the mill closed, that she was saving money to go back to school. By midsummer, he asked her to the county fair. They rode the Ferris wheel, walked through the livestock barns, and shared a paper cone of fried dough. When he kissed her goodnight on her porch, she rested her hands on the brim of his cap for a moment, but didn't try to take it off. They married the next year in a small ceremony at the Methodist church. No tuxedo, no veil, just a simple dress and a suit that still smelled faintly of mothballs from the thrift shop. She moved into his small apartment above the hardware store until they saved enough for a house on the edge of town, a narrow 2-story place with a porch swing and a patchy lawn. In 1976, Emily was born. John held her in the hospital room, her tiny fist gripping his finger, and thought about all the things he'd managed to survive to get to this moment. He told himself nothing could touch him now, but by then the bump on his scalp had company. 2 more had appeared, one just behind his left ear, the other along the crown. They were small, no bigger than marbles, but they were there. Sometimes, when Linda ran her fingers through his hair, he'd shift away before she could feel them. She never asked why. Maybe she thought it was just his way. Over the years the bumps multiplied. By the time Emily was in grade school, there were 6. A few had grown large enough that he could feel their weight when he leaned his head back against the couch. They still didn't hurt much, but they itched sometimes, deep under the skin where scratching didn't reach. He started wearing the cap almost all the time, indoors, outdoors, even at the dinner table. Linda would tease him once in a while, but it was always gentle. "Gonna get a tan line up there," she'd say, tapping the brim. When friends or neighbors asked, he'd just say it was habit, and it was, in a way. The hat became part of him, like his watch or the calluses on his palms. Without it, he felt unfinished. In the garage, the other mechanics didn't think twice. A cap was practical, kept sweat out of your eyes, kept oil from matting your hair. But John knew the real reason. Each year the mirror showed a scalp more crowded than the year before. The hair over the lumps was thinning, revealing their outlines in the harsh bathroom light. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, Linda came up behind him while he was brushing his teeth. She rested her chin lightly on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. She hesitated, then kissed his cheek. "Okay." That was it. No follow-up, no insistence. She let him keep his silence, and he loved her for that. But the quiet between them on the subject grew heavier as the years passed. By the late 1980s, there were at least 10 bumps. Some were firm and fixed, others had a slight give, like they were tethered to the skin by something soft. He knew they weren't going away, and he knew, deep down, that one day they might not let him hide them anymore. For now, though, the cap still fit, and as long as it did, he wasn't ready to take it off. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of late summer day when the air inside the garage felt thick enough to chew. The big bay doors were open to let in what little breeze there was, but mostly it just let the heat roll through. The place smelled of motor oil, brake fluid, and the faint metallic tang of ground steel. John was working under the hood of a Dodge van, sweat running down his temples, the brim of his cap casting a shadow across his eyes. The job was routine, replace a faulty water pump, but the bolts were stubborn, corroded into place. He leaned over the engine, wrench in hand, putting his weight into it. The metal groaned but refused to budge. He adjusted his grip, braced himself, and pulled harder. The wrench gave suddenly, and so did his balance. He lurched forward, the side of his head catching the sharp corner of the raised hood. A bright pain flared just above his right temple, so sharp it made him suck in a breath. His hand went instinctively to the spot, and that's when he felt it, a hot, wet slide between his fingers. The largest of the bumps had split. Warm blood ran down the side of his face, thick and fast, dripping from his jaw onto the engine block. The sound it made, a faint, wet patter, was lost under the low hum of the shop, but the sight of it wasn't. "Jesus, John." One of the younger mechanics, Rick, was standing a few feet away, eyes wide. He took a step forward, then froze, his gaze flicking from the blood to the brim of John's cap. "It's fine," John said quickly, pressing his palm harder against his head. The pressure sent a pulse of pain through his scalp, but it slowed the flow. He could feel the skin beneath his hand, slick and ragged, the way the jungle mud had felt when you scooped it up and it refused to hold shape. "That's not fine," Rick said, his voice lower now, like he wasn't sure he wanted the others to hear. The shop foreman, Hal, glanced over from his bench, frowning. "You need a doc?" "No." John's voice was flat, final. He reached for a rag from his back pocket, pressing it to his head as he stepped away from the van. The rag turned dark almost immediately, the smell of iron mixing with the grease on his hands. He could feel eyes on him as he crossed the floor. No one said anything else, but the air had shifted. The normal clang and hiss of tools seemed distant, muted. Even the radio in the corner, usually blaring classic rock, felt too loud against the silence that had opened between him and the others. In the small restroom at the back of the garage, he locked the door and leaned over the sink. The mirror above it was cracked in one corner, distorting the reflection. He lifted the cap just enough to see the damage, a jagged tear in the skin of the largest growth, blood oozing steadily. Around it, the other bumps rose like a strange, uneven crown. He ran water over a paper towel, dabbing carefully, wincing when the sting hit. The blood thinned under the water, spiraling pink into the drain. He cleaned it as best he could, folded the rag so the clean side faced out, and pressed it back into place. When he returned to the floor, no one asked questions. Rick kept his head down over the brake job he was working on. Hal gave him a look, half concern, half calculation, but didn't press. That was how it went in small towns and tight crews. You didn't dig into a man's private business unless he invited you. Still, John could feel it. The quiet had changed. He'd been careful for years, and now they'd seen just enough to know there was something under that cap worth wondering about. That night, at home, he sat in the kitchen long after dark, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He kept the cap on, even though the rag beneath it was damp against his scalp. The incident at the garage replayed in his mind, the slip, the impact, the look on Rick's face. It wasn't shock at the blood. It was the shock of realizing the blood had come from something strange. He poured himself a drink, took a long swallow, and set the glass down hard enough to make the ice clink. If anyone asked tomorrow, he'd tell them it was nothing. A scrape, a cut. Not worth talking about. But alone in the dim light, he knew the truth. The hat wasn't just habit anymore. It was armor. And once armor takes on that job, you don't take it off until the fight is over, if it ever is. Emily had been curious about his cap for as long as she could remember. When she was little, 4, maybe 5, she'd crawl into his lap after dinner, her small hands reaching up to the brim. "Why do you always wear this, Daddy?" she'd ask, tilting her head to try and see underneath. He'd smile, scoop her up, and set her on the floor with a gentle pat. "Keeps my head warm," he'd say, and that would be enough. At that age, she believed him. But kids grow. By the time she was in middle school, the question came with a little more edge. "It's summer, you're wearing a jacket and a hat. That's weird." "Helps with the sun," he'd reply, not looking up from the sports section. When she was 15, she asked in front of Linda, "Mom, why doesn't Dad ever take his hat off?" The room went still for a moment. Linda, without missing a beat, said, "Some habits are just hard to break." She gave John a quick glance, the kind of glance that said, "I'm covering for you." Again. After that, Emily stopped asking, at least out loud, but he'd catch her sometimes, watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze flicking to the brim and back. The years passed. Linda got sick, and then one spring she was gone. The house felt like it had doubled in size overnight, all that empty space humming around him. Emily was in her 20s by then, living 2 hours away, working long shifts at the hospital. She came home when she could, usually on Sundays, bringing groceries and stories about her patients. It was on one of those Sundays, a few years after Linda's funeral, that the distance between them cracked. She was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail he'd left in a heap. "You need to open these, Dad," she said, holding up a stack of envelopes. "Some of them look important." "They're not," he said, rinsing his coffee cup. She set the envelopes down and leaned back in the chair, her eyes locking onto him. "Why don't you ever take your hat off?" The question landed differently this time. No curiosity, no playfulness, just blunt force. He turned his back to her, drying the cup. "I told you before. Habit. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got." She stood now, her voice sharpening. "Is it because of Vietnam?" He set the cup in the rack, turned to face her. "Some things are better left alone, Emily." Her jaw tightened. "Better for who? You've been hiding something from me my whole life, and I'm not a kid anymore. You can trust me." "It's not about trust." "Then what is it about?" He didn't answer. The silence between them felt like it was made of glass, thin, brittle, dangerous to touch. After a moment, she shook her head, grabbed her bag from the chair. "Fine," she said. "You don't want to tell me, don't, but don't pretend it's not there." She left, the screen door snapping shut behind her. He stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the sound of her car fading down the street. He reached up, touched the brim of his cap, and felt the familiar stubborn shapes underneath. He told himself he was protecting her, from what exactly he couldn't say. Maybe from the sight of it. Maybe from the questions it would bring. Maybe from the possibility that she'd look at him differently once she knew. And maybe, if he was honest, from the fact that telling her would mean saying it out loud, naming it, making it real. That was a battle he wasn't ready to fight. Not yet. The call came on a gray afternoon in early November. The light through the kitchen window had that flat, colorless quality that made the whole room feel colder than it was. John was sitting at the table with the newspaper folded to the crossword, a pencil in his hand, when the phone rang. He considered letting it go to the machine. Most calls were sales pitches or wrong numbers these days. But habit won, and he picked it up. "Dad?" Emily's voice was on the other end, steady, but with a tightness in it he recognized. "Yeah. Everything all right?" There was a pause long enough for him to picture her on the other end, deciding how to start. "I heard from someone today," she said. "You remember Uncle Ray, Mom's cousin? He served in Nam too." John's fingers tightened around the pencil. "Yeah, I remember. He passed away last week." The words landed heavy, but not with surprise. He and Ray hadn't spoken in years. Not out of bad blood, just distance and time. Still, the news pressed something in his chest. I'm sorry to hear that. They think it was complications from a skin condition, Emily went on, something he picked up overseas. John stared at the pencil in his hand, the way the wood grain spiraled toward the tip. Yeah? His daughter told me there's a veterans medical program, free screenings for guys who served in high-risk areas. They've got dermatologists who specialize in this stuff. Dad, I think you should go. I'm fine, he said, automatic. You're not fine, she said, her voice sharpening. You've been hiding something from me for years, and don't tell me it's just a habit. I'm not a kid anymore. He pushed the newspaper away, the pencil rolling off the table. Emily, it's not something I want to get into. Well, I think it's something you need to get into, she shot back. I made you an appointment. Next Thursday, 10 a.m. You made me an appointment? Yes. And I'm picking you up. You can yell at me later if you want, but you're going. He almost laughed at the sheer nerve of it. Almost. Instead, he said, Emily, Dad, please. Her tone shifted now, the edge softening. Do it for me, for your grandkids. The room felt too still, the ticking of the kitchen clock too loud. He thought of Ray, how he'd left Vietnam carrying something inside him he never talked about, how it had followed him all the way to the end. He let out a long breath. I'll go. Thank you, she said, the relief in her voice clear. I'll be there at 10. When they hung up, he sat at the table for a while without moving. The cap felt heavier on his head, like it knew what was coming. Outside, wind rattled the bare branches against the side of the house. He thought about the first time he'd met Ray, both of them young, standing in a muddy camp on the far side of the world, the rain soaking them to the bone. He thought about the last time he'd seen him, at Linda's funeral, the two of them standing side by side in awkward silence, both men keeping their caps firmly in place. Next Thursday was only a week away, but it felt closer than that. The clinic was newer than John expected, automatic glass doors that slid open without a sound, a wide lobby washed in pale morning light. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. For a moment, he stood just outside, his reflection caught in the glass. A man in his 70s with a weathered face, shoulders set stiff, and a cap pulled low enough to cast a shadow over his eyes. Emily touched his elbow, as if she sensed he might turn around. It's just a checkup, she said softly. No one's going to judge you. John grunted something that could have meant anything and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up from her screen and smiled, one of those bright professional smiles that didn't pry. She slid a clipboard across the counter. If you could fill this out, Mr. Miller. He took the pen, printing his name in careful block letters. The form asked for his service history, deployment locations, and current health concerns. When he reached that last line, his pen hovered for a long time before moving on without writing a word. They sat in the waiting area, a flat-screen TV on the wall, showing a morning talk show neither of them paid attention to. John's hands rested on the brim of his cap, fingertips tracing the worn stitching. Every time the exam room door opened, his shoulders tightened. A nurse called his name. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with an efficient smile. Right this way, Mr. Miller. Emily rose, but John gave a small shake of his head. I'll be fine. The hallway walls were lined with framed photographs of veterans from different eras, black and white portraits from World War II, grainy shots from Korea, faded color images from Vietnam. John recognized the same stance in all of them, the straight shoulders, the set jaws, the eyes that had seen more than they said. The exam room was small, bright, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. John sat on the padded table, the paper crinkling under his weight. He adjusted the cap so it sat firmly, almost offensively on his head. The door opened again, and a man in his 50s stepped in wearing a white coat. His handshake was firm, his voice steady. John Miller? I'm Dr. Harris. I understand you served in Vietnam? That's right. Dr. Harris glanced at the thin file in his hand, then back at John. Your daughter mentioned you've had growths on your scalp for a long time. How long exactly? John's gaze dropped to the floor. Since, probably the late 60s. The doctor's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't comment. He pulled a rolling stool closer. Well, the best place to start is with a visual exam. John's hand went to the brim of his cap. Do we have to? Harris's tone stayed even. If we want to understand what's going on, yes. I can't give you much without seeing them. The room seemed to shrink. John could feel the pulse in his ears, the air pressing in on him. 50 years of keeping the hat in place. Birthdays, funerals, weddings, and now, this. He stared at the doctor for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. All right, he said quietly. His fingers tightened on the brim. For the first time in decades, he began to lift the cap from his head. The cap came away slowly, as if reluctant to leave. Cool air touched John's scalp for the first time in years, and the sensation made him shiver. He kept his eyes on the floor, unwilling to meet the doctor's gaze. Dr. Harris didn't speak right away. His eyes moved methodically over the surface of John's head, taking in the raised, fleshy clusters scattered across the crown and sides. Some were smooth and pale, others darker and puckered, their texture uneven like weathered stone. A few swayed slightly when John shifted, pendulous like overripe grapes on thin stems. "How many are there?" Harris asked gently, his voice stripped of judgment. 14, John said flatly. "Last I counted." Harris leaned closer, examining the largest one near the crown. "Do they bleed often?" "Sometimes, if I bump them. One split open years ago. I haven't let anyone see them since." The doctor gave a single thoughtful nod, as if filing away both the words and the weight behind them. He picked up a small penlight and tilted John's head to one side, casting the beam across the uneven terrain. "Some of these are anchored deeper into the dermis," he said. "I'd like to take some photographs and a biopsy, just a small sample from one or two. That'll tell us exactly what we're dealing with." "Biopsy?" John repeated, the word heavy on his tongue. "It's quick," Harris reassured him. "A little pinch, a couple of stitches, will numb the area." John hesitated, his fingers curling around the cap in his lap. "What are you looking for?" "There are a few possibilities," Harris said, choosing his words carefully. "Some growths like this can be precancerous, or even malignant in rare cases. But there are also benign conditions, sometimes genetic, sometimes environmental. Without testing, I can't be certain." The word cancer landed in John's chest like a lead weight. He'd seen young men bleed out in the mud, watched life slip away in minutes, but the thought of something growing inside him, slow and silent, was different. It wasn't the battlefield. It was an ambush. The procedure was as Harris promised, a sharp sting from the anesthetic, the odd tugging sensation as a small section was removed, and the faint metallic smell of sterilized instruments. John sat rigid, staring at a spot on the far wall, the sound of the scissors snipping blending in his mind with the memory of rain dripping from jungle leaves. When Harris stepped out with the sample, John's hands went to the cap but stopped short of putting it back on. The room felt strangely open without it, like a door left ajar. It was nearly 20 minutes before the doctor returned, a folder in his hand. He pulled the stool close again. "Well, first things first, it's not cancer." John let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "What you have is something similar to Brooks-Spiegler syndrome," Harris explained. "It's rare. Essentially, your skin has been forming multiple benign tumors over time. In your case, prolonged exposure to damp, contaminated environments, like what you experienced in Vietnam, may have triggered it." "Benign," John repeated slowly, tasting the word. "They won't spread to your organs or turn into something worse," Harris continued. "But they will keep growing if left alone. Some are deep enough that they could bleed or become infected, especially if they're bumped or scraped." John looked down at the cap in his hands. "So what now?" "We start by removing the largest and most vulnerable ones," Harris said. "Outpatient procedures, under local anesthesia. We might need more than one session to address them all. You'll heal faster if we space them out." The idea of someone cutting into his scalp made John's stomach clench. But beneath the unease, something else stirred, a faint sense of possibility. The thought of walking outside without the brim shadowing his face felt almost impossible, and yet not entirely unwelcome. John nodded once. "All right, let's do it." The surgical room was smaller than John expected, almost claustrophobic, with white walls that seemed to press in. Overhead, a bank of lights poured down a sterile brightness that made every surface, metal trays, glass jars, stainless steel tools, glint coldly. The smell of antiseptic was sharp enough to sting his nose. Dr. Harris stood at his left shoulder, already in gloves, his voice calm and deliberate. "We'll start with local anesthesia. You'll be awake, but you shouldn't feel pain, just some pressure." John nodded stiffly. His hands gripped the edge of the padded table, the paper beneath him crinkling with each shift of his weight. A nurse swabbed his scalp with a cool, tingling solution that made him shiver. The first injection stung like a hornet, and in an instant, the sterile room dissolved into something else entirely. He was 22 again, crouched low in the jungle, helmet pressing down on his skull while the rain ran in rivulets down his neck. The smell of antiseptic blurred into the thick green scent of wet leaves, rotting vegetation, and gun oil. "Pressure," Harris warned. The tug at his skin was slow, deliberate, like someone pulling a root out of stubborn ground. John's jaw tightened. Beneath the doctor's steady voice, he thought he could hear another rhythm, the soft, persistent drip of water from an unseen jungle canopy. He blinked, and the surgical lights became the harsh white flare of an artillery illumination round, bleaching the trees for a moment before plunging them back into blackness. In that afterimage, he saw himself on night watch, M16 cradled in his arms, the first itch crawling along his scalp under the helmet. "First one's out," Harris said. He held it up briefly, pale, rounded, no bigger than a grape, before dropping it into a small metal dish with a muted clink. John looked at it only for a second. It was strange how harmless it seemed in that dish, after years of being part of him, dictating how he moved through the world. The second and third came out more easily. Each time, Harris worked with a rhythm, cut, lift, stitch, that was almost hypnotic. John's shoulders began to ease, and with each removal, the image of the jungle in his mind grew less oppressive, as if some part of it was being drawn out with the growths. Midway through the procedure, the pressure on his head shifted, and another memory slipped in uninvited late monsoon season, the swamp water up to his thighs, helmet liner soaked and heavy against his scalp. The bumps had been smaller then, almost invisible, but he could feel them. Alien, stubborn, like seeds in the soil that refused to rot. "Halfway there," Harris murmured, as a nurse dabbed away a thin line of blood. John breathed slowly, counting each inhalation. For years he had imagined these things as enemies that couldn't be fought, silent occupiers entrenched too deeply. Now, under the bright light, they were being driven out one by one. By the time Harris removed the sixth, the back of John's head felt strangely light, almost unbalanced. 12 would be taken out in total, spread over 3 separate sessions. Today's 6 were the largest and most at risk of bleeding. The final stitch tugged gently at his skin, and Harris leaned back, stripping off his gloves. "That's it for today. You did well." John exhaled. His neck muscles ached from tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The nurse handed him a small mirror. "Want to see?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then slowly he lifted it and angled it toward the crown of his head. The sight startled him, not because of the small stitched lines, but because the landscape he'd known for decades was different, smoother, less crowded. He didn't smile, but something inside loosened, like a knot that had been tied for half a lifetime. Harris spoke again, his tone practical but not unkind. "You'll need a week or so to heal before we do the next set. But this is a good start, John. A very good start." John nodded, setting the mirror down. "Feels strange. Strange can be good," Harris said with a faint smile. As they wheeled the tray of instruments away, John sat there for another moment, feeling the weight of the cap in his lap. For decades, it had been his shield. Now, for the first time, it felt like something he might eventually be able to put away. The second surgery came a week later. The stitches from the first session were still tight, itching in a way that made John want to reach up in the middle of the night and scratch until they tore. He didn't. Dr. Harris had been clear. Keep the area clean, no touching, no risks. The waiting room felt less intimidating this time. Emily sat beside him, flipping idly through a magazine she clearly wasn't reading. He caught her glancing at him now and then, as if checking to make sure he hadn't changed his mind. "You sure you want to do the rest?" she asked. He thought about the mirror after the first surgery, the bare patch of skin where there had been nothing but lumps for decades. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." The procedure room was just as bright, just as cold. But this time, when the cap came off, he didn't feel that same rush of panic. The nurse's hands were steady as she cleaned the area, her movements efficient but not rushed. "Pressure," Harris warned again as the anesthesia took hold. The second set of growths came out faster. 4 of them, smaller than the first batch, but lodged in awkward spots where the scalp curved and thinned. Each removal left behind a faint tugging sensation, as if a piece of him were being peeled away, one layer at a time. Somewhere between the second and third, his mind slipped again, back to Vietnam, but not the damp, claustrophobic jungle this time. Instead, he saw the departure, the roar of the transport plane's engines, the strange mix of relief and disbelief that he was leaving. He remembered telling himself he was done with the war. Now he wondered if the war had been done with him. When Harris was finished, the nurse pressed a gauze pad gently against the fresh stitches. "You're healing well," she said. "No signs of infection." John nodded, but inside something was shifting. The second surgery hadn't just taken away more of the bumps. It had chipped away at the reflexive need to hide. The third and final surgery was different. Harris had left the 2 smallest growths for last. "They weren't dangerous," he'd explained, "but they completed the work. It'll be the cleanest we can get it," he said. John sat on the table, cap in his lap, running his thumb over the frayed brim. "Guess this is it," he muttered. "This is it," Harris confirmed. The needle's sting barely registered. By now the rhythm was familiar. Cut, lift, stitch. The smallest growth slipped free easily, no more resistance than pulling a pebble from mud. The last one, though, was stubborn. Harris worked slowly, careful not to tear the surrounding tissue. As the final suture went in, John felt an unexpected surge of relief. Not the cautious, measured relief of the first surgery, but something deeper, final, like closing a door he'd kept half open for too long. When Harris handed him the mirror this time, John looked without hesitation. His scalp bore the faint cross-hatching of healing stitches, but it was smooth in ways he hadn't seen in 50 years. The change was stark and strangely humanizing. "You'll still have scars," Harris said. "But they're just that, scars, nothing to hide." John set the mirror down slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I think I can live with that." And that night, at home, he didn't reach for the cap before sitting down in his recliner. The air felt cool on his head, almost refreshing. He caught his reflection in the darkened television screen, different, unfamiliar, but not foreign. For years the bumps had been his armor and his prison. Piece by piece they'd been taken away, and with them, a part of the jungle he'd carried for half a century. He hadn't realized how heavy it had been until now, when it was finally gone. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the quiet settle in. The first morning after the final surgery, John woke before the sun. The house was still, the air cool enough to raise a faint shiver along his bare scalp. For a moment he lay in bed and listened, to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, to the faint tick of the hallway clock. No rain, no jungle, just quiet. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and paused, staring at the cap resting on the nightstand. It was habit to reach for it before anything else. This time, he didn't. He stood and walked to the bathroom, turning on the light. The mirror didn't lie. The stitches were still there, thin black lines like careful handwriting across pale skin. But the landscape had changed. Where once the bumps had risen like foreign growths, there was now smoothness broken only by the healing seams. It was strange, almost unsettling to see so much of his own head after decades of shadow. He touched one of the newer scars gently. The skin was tender but whole. For years he'd avoided mirrors that showed the top of his head. Now he lingered. Downstairs the kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee. He brewed a fresh pot, the sound and smell grounding him. When he stepped onto the porch with his mug, the morning breeze brushed directly across his scalp for the first time since he was 22. It was lighter than he expected, like a hand passing over him without weight. By the third day, Emily stopped by with groceries. She let herself in, calling his name before stepping into the kitchen. "You're not wearing it," she said after a beat. He looked up from the paper. "Guess not." She set the bags down, her smile slow but warm. "It suits you," she said. "The no hat thing." John shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his chest. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief. The first trip into town without the cap came a week later. He told himself it was just to pick up mail at the post office, but he knew it was more than that. It was a test. The air outside was brisk, the kind of cold that sharpened the smell of wood smoke from chimneys. As he walked down Main Street, he kept waiting for the stares, the questions, the whispers. They didn't come. Mrs. Parker from across the street waved from her car. The clerk at the post office greeted him the same way she always had. It wasn't that no one noticed. He caught a few double takes, a few curious glances, but they were fleeting, without judgment. If anything, he realized, people seemed more willing to look him in the eye. Without the brim casting a shadow, there was nothing between his gaze and theirs. At home, the change was subtler but more profound. The evening light slanted through the living room window, catching the framed photographs on the wall. One in particular drew his attention, a black and white shot of him in uniform, helmet slightly askew, rain streaking down his face. He studied the younger man in the picture. The eyes were the same, but the weight behind them had shifted. That boy had no idea what he'd be carrying 50 years later. When the grandkids came over the next weekend, there was no ceremony, no build-up. They barreled into the house with the unfiltered energy only children have. The youngest stopped short for half a second when he saw John without the cap, then grinned. "You look different, Grandpa," he said. "Better or worse?" John asked. "Better," the boy said, already running off toward the kitchen. Emily caught his eye from across the room. She didn't need to say anything. But that night, after they'd all left, John sat on the porch again. The cap was inside now, hanging on the wall beside the Vietnam photo. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of grass and distant rain. He closed his eyes and let it move across him, unfiltered. For the first time in decades, there was no sense of hiding, no reflexive reach for the brim. The jungle was still part of him, but it no longer dictated how he stepped out into the world. He thought about what Harris had said. Scars are just that, scars. They didn't define you unless you let them. He sipped his coffee, the night settling in around him, and realized he was ready for the next thing, whatever that might be. The day of Emily's cookout dawned clear, with sunlight spilling over the Pennsylvania hills in slow, golden strokes. John sat in his truck outside her house for a good 5 minutes after parking. From here he could already hear the hum of voices, children laughing, the low murmur of adults, the faint sizzle of something cooking on the grill. His right hand rested on the brim of his cap lying on the passenger seat. The habit to put it on before stepping out was as ingrained as breathing. Today, he left it there. When he finally stepped into the backyard, the smell of charcoal and grilled burgers hit him first. Emily was near the picnic table, arranging plates of corn on the cob. She spotted him, and her smile lit up in that way he remembered from when she was little. "Dad, you made it!" Heads turned as he walked across the grass. The sunlight was warm on his bare scalp, an unfamiliar sensation in such a public setting. For a split second, he felt all eyes on him, and the old reflex to duck his head surged. But the moment passed. People smiled, waved, and then turned back to their conversations. No whispers, no stares that lingered too long. The kids were the first to close the distance. The youngest, popsicle in hand, looked up at him with the frank curiosity only a child could have. "You said maybe later," he reminded John, grinning. "Is it later now?" John chuckled. "Yeah, guess it is." The boy's grin widened before he darted back to the swing set, apparently satisfied. Around them, the rhythms of the afternoon continued, the clink of ice in glasses, the hiss of the grill, the occasional burst of laughter from the card game happening at one end of the yard. Emily came closer, her eyes glistening just enough for him to notice. "You look good," she said quietly. "Feels strange," he admitted. "Good strange?" He thought about it for a second. "Yeah, good strange." They stood like that for a moment, saying nothing more. The simplicity of it, the ease, felt almost foreign after so many years of avoiding this very scenario. After lunch, John found himself sitting beneath the shade of an old maple tree, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. The breeze moved freely across his head, cool and clean, and he realized just how heavy the hat had been, not in weight, but in what it carried. Across the yard he caught sight of the cap. Emily had placed it on a chair by the back porch, almost like it had its own seat at the gathering. For decades, it had been his shield. Today it was just an object. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in easy beats, games with the kids, swapping stories with Emily's neighbors, even allowing someone to take a photo of him with his granddaughter on his shoulders, her tiny hands resting on his bare head. As the sun dipped lower, painting the yard in amber light, Emily handed him a paper plate piled with the last burger from the grill. "For the road," she said with a smile. On that evening, the house was quiet when he returned. He set the plate in the kitchen, poured himself a coffee, and walked to the hallway where his old photographs hung. There was one picture he always lingered on, a young Marine in the rain, helmet slightly askew, jaw set against whatever lay ahead. Without looking away, John took the cap from the chair where it had been left that afternoon. The fabric was worn soft from decades of use, the color faded to something between gray and olive. Near the back was the faint, dark stain from jungle sap, still there after all these years. For a long time, he'd thought of that mark as permanent, just like the things it represented. He picked up a small nail and hammered it into the wall just above the photograph. The sound was sharp in the quiet house. Then he hung the cap there, letting it rest against the glass of the frame. He stepped back. The young Marine in the photo stared out from beneath the brim of his helmet, while the old cap, its service complete, hung still beside him. "I think we're done now," John murmured. 10 later, sitting on the porch with the evening breeze brushing his scalp, he thought about how strange it felt to be bareheaded in the open. Strange, but not uncomfortable. He realized the hat had shielded him from more than sunlight. It had been a wall, one that kept questions at bay, but also kept him apart. Removing it hadn't just uncovered his head, it had opened a door. For the first time in 50 years, he wasn't carrying the jungle on his back. It was still part of him, yes, but it no longer dictated the terms of his life. The crickets began their nightly chorus. John leaned back, watching the last light fade over the hills, and felt something rare settle in his chest. Peace. Sometimes the heaviest battles aren't fought in jungles or under enemy fire. They're fought in the quiet, behind closed doors, under the brim of a hat. John Miller knew this now. For 50 years he'd carried the war with him, not in medals or scars that could be seen, but in the silent weight of something no one else could name. The hat had been more than fabric and thread. It had been a wall, a shield, a way to keep the world from asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. But walls, no matter how strong, change the person who lives behind them. They keep the hurt out maybe, but they keep the light out too. When he finally set that hat down, something shifted. It wasn't about the bumps on his scalp, or even about what caused them. It was about the space they had taken up in his life, the choices they had quietly shaped, the moments they had stolen. On the porch that evening, with the crickets singing and the last of the sunlight brushing the hills, John realized that letting go didn't erase the past. It didn't need to. The past had its place, but it didn't need to sit on his head, heavy and constant any longer. Inside, in the hallway, the cap hung beside the photograph of a young Marine in the rain. It would always be there, part of his story, but no longer the whole story. He thought about the jungle, about the heat and the damp and the sound of rain on metal, about the boy he'd been and the man who came home, about the years in between when he thought surviving meant hiding. And then he thought about today, the sunlight, the laughter, the wind moving across his bare scalp like something new. If you were carrying something for decades, fear, pain, or a secret, would you have the courage to set it down? John had, and in doing so, he'd found something he didn't expect. Not just relief, not just healing, freedom. And for the first time in half a century, he stepped fully into the light. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones no one else can see, the ones we fight in silence, carrying our pain like a secret for years. John Miller's story reminds us that letting go isn't about forgetting the past. It's about making space for the life we still have left to live. Picture this, a faded Marine cap hanging beside the photograph of a young soldier in the rain, no longer needed, but never forgotten. If you were carrying something heavy for decades, fear, regret, or a secret, would you have the courage to set it down? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be the reason someone else takes that step. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there are more powerful true stories waiting to be told.